The Silence of Remembrance. Margaret Whistler sat motionless, her aged hands folded neatly in her lap. The room around her was still, save for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. She had been sitting for her son James's portrait for what felt like hours, though she knew it had only been a matter of minutes. "Mother," James's voice broke through her reverie. "You've shifted slightly. Could you please resume your original position?" Margaret nodded almost imperceptibly and adjusted herself. As she settled back into the pose, her mind wandered to the events that had led to this moment. It had been 5 years since her beloved husband George had passed away, 5 years of silence in a house that had once been filled with laughter and debate. George had been an engineer, a man of science and progress. He encouraged their son's artistic pursuits, even when Margaret had doubts. "Art is the future, my dear," George would say. "James has a gift. We must nurture it." Now, as she sat for her son's portrait, Margaret couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. She had been so focused on etiquette, on what society expected of a young man, that she had nearly stifled James's talent. It was George who had insisted on sending him to Paris to study despite Margaret's protests. "Mother," James's voice interrupted her thoughts once more. "Your expression has changed. Try to look pensive if you will." Margaret almost smiled at the irony. Pensive was all she felt these days. As James continued to work, Margaret's gaze drifted to the small framed etching on the wall. It was a view of the Thames, one of James's early works. Much to Margaret's dismay, George had insisted on framing it and hanging it in the parlor. It was a cherished reminder of both her son's talent and her husband's foresight. The curtains to her left, with their intricate floral pattern, had been a wedding gift from George's mother. Margaret remembered how she had marveled at the delicate embroidery, tracing the petals with her fingertips. The once vibrant colors had faded, much like the memories of those early, joyful days of marriage. "James," Margaret spoke softly, breaking the silence in the room. "Do you remember the summers we spent in Stonington?" Her son paused, brush hovering over the canvas. "Of course, Mother. Father would take us sailing, and you would pack those magnificent picnic baskets." Margaret nodded, careful not to disturb her pose. "Your father loved the sea. He always said it reminded him of the vastness of human potential." James resumed painting, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "He was a remarkable man." "Yes," Margaret agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself lost in memories. She remembered the day James was born, and how George had paced the hallway outside her room for hours. She recalled James's first steps and words, and the first time he picked up a pencil and drew a recognizable shape. "It's a boat, Margaret," George had exclaimed, holding up the crude drawing. "Our boy's an artist." Margaret had laughed then, amused by her husband's enthusiasm. Now the memory brought tears to her eyes. "Mother," James's concerned voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you all right?" Margaret blinked rapidly, composing herself. "Yes, dear. Just a bit of dust in my eye." James nodded, though his brow remained furrowed. "We can take a break if you'd like." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Let's continue. Your father would have wanted us to finish." As James returned to his work, Margaret's thoughts turned to the future. She was getting older, and James made a name for himself in art. Soon, she knew, he would likely move away permanently, to London, Paris, or even America. The thought filled her with both pride and a profound sense of loss, a feeling that resonated deep within her. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder, each second a reminder of the relentless passage of time. Margaret wished to stop it, and freeze this moment with her son. Despite the melancholy that had settled over her, there was comfort in his presence, in the knowledge that George's faith in their son had been well placed. James finally set down his brush, as the light outside began to fade. "I think that's enough for today, Mother. Thank you for your patience." Margaret rose slowly, her joints stiff from sitting for so long. She walked over to the canvas, curious to see how James had captured her. The woman in the painting was undeniably her, and yet, there was something more. James had somehow managed to capture not just her likeness, but the weight of her memories, the depth of her love for her family, and the quiet strength that had sustained her through loss. "Oh, James," she breathed, reaching out to touch the canvas before catching herself. Her son stood beside her, studying his work with a critical eye. "I'm not sure I've done you justice, Mother." Margaret turned to him, tears glistening in her eyes. "You've done more than that, my dear boy. You've captured my soul." James looked at her, surprise evident on his face. It was the most effusive praise she had ever given his work. "Your father would be so proud," Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion. "As am I." James wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders, and for a moment they stood in silence, contemplating the painting and all it represented. As the last light of day faded, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The portrait was more than just a painting, it was a bridge between past and future, a testament to the enduring power of love and family. "Shall we have some tea?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. James smiled, squeezing her shoulder gently. "That sounds wonderful, Mother." As they left the room, Margaret glanced at the portrait. The woman in the painting gazed back, her eyes filled with a lifetime of memories, sorrows and joys. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt indeed seen.